Dan.
Hey Claire, how are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
It's great to see you. I really like doing these sort of in-between webinar Q&A sessions.
Yes, especially when we have breaking news topics like what we addressed on this month's webinar with the Supreme Court news and leaked draft opinion on Roe versus Wade. So as always, we had so many questions that we couldn't answer on the live webinar, but Dan and I have selected a few of those that we did not answer, and we will get to those right now.
Yeah, and this isn't an issue that's going away anytime soon, Claire, so I know we'll talk about it in future webinars, but I'm glad we can answer at least a few more questions because I know there were a lot that came in.
Okay, Dan, so with that, our first question for today is, what would be the middle ground solution if possibly pursued by Justice Roberts?
Okay. Well, first of all, Claire, it's worth remembering that Roberts himself is an extremely conservative individual appointed by a Republican president and by all measures is fairly strongly pro-life himself. That said, Roberts does see his role as Chief Justice as a conciliator. He's made it very clear over the years that he's extremely concerned about maintaining the Supreme Court's role and identity in American society. So he tends to look for a way to serve as a unifier in a way that he might not if he were simply an associate justice. All that said, my point is that Roberts' idea of a compromise might not be ideal for most pro-choice advocates, but it's probably not going to be nearly as ambitious as the Alito draft suggested. What do we see? Well, based on what Roberts has said in the past, it's entirely likely that he would see a compromise in which a ban on abortion simply moved earlier in the term of a pregnancy. And just as the Mississippi law calls for a ban after 15 weeks, it's reasonable to assume that's what Roberts would see as a reasonable compromise. So rather than the current law, which sets that threshold, it's somewhere between 22 and 24 weeks. The 15-week threshold that's called for in the Mississippi law and proposals in other states as well is probably the most likely middle ground that Roberts would shoot for, not just because of his own preference, but because of his realization that he'd need to bring at least one of the five more conservative justices along with him. Public opinion polling shows that a plurality of Americans actually do support a ban after 15 weeks, not quite a majority, but more Americans than a plurality think that that is a reasonable threshold as opposed to those who would like to see it longer. Can Roberts pull that off? We'll see. His most likely target is Justice Brett Kavanaugh, but that probably is the compromise that he's been talking to his fellow justices about.
Thank you, Dan. So our next audience question is, do you think that this will motivate higher turnout for the Democrats in this year's midterm elections, or even beyond in the 2024 presidential election?
Well, we don't know the answer to that question. What I will tell you is that historically, voters who oppose abortion tend to be more motivated to turn out to vote when the issue is highly visible in an election campaign. And even just 2 years ago in 2020, after the death of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg and the time of the very accelerated confirmation of now Justice Amy Coney Barrett, there was some thinking that pro-choice voters might turn out in larger numbers, being motivated by the high profile of that discussion. Turned out not to be the case. A lot more voters turned out on the basis of the abortion issue who opposed abortion than those who supported it. But this may be different. For the most part, for the last almost half a century, abortion debates for many Americans have taken place almost on a theoretical basis. And now that the prospect of Roe versus Wade being completely overturned is a real one, there are a lot of Democrats who do believe this will be a key to motivate their base to turn out in the fall. So we don't know the answer yet. Early polling shows a mixed bag. It shows that more voters support Roe staying in place than oppose it. But at least right now, it looks like the motivational edge may still belong to the Republicans. But there's a long way to go between now and November. And my own feeling, Claire, for what it's worth, is that if Democrats do have a chance to maintain their congressional majorities in one or both chambers this fall, it will be because they have been able to motivate their most loyal supporters, particularly younger people who weren't alive when Roe versus Wade was first passed, to turn out in much larger numbers than it would otherwise be the case. It doesn't look like that's something they have in the bag. It's not something that early polling shows has been accomplished to date. But I think it is the best bet for a Democratic majority if they can find a way to effectively deliver that message to the most progressive members of their party who might otherwise not be all that motivated after the first 2 years of the Biden administration.
Thank you, Dan. Our final audience question that we'll get to today is it possible that not just abortion, but contraception and morning after pills will be targeted? If yes, how will Gen Z and millennials react?
Well, it's interesting that the questioner raises this because we're already seeing in some more conservative states that have already passed a ban on abortion that would trigger into effect if the court did overturn Roe versus Wade. We're already seeing in a number of those states similar legislation that just like it would, just as they're looking at bills that would prohibit abortion, they're looking at companion legislation that would prohibit a medicinal option. Now that's going to be much more difficult to build public support for. And in a number of very conservative states, that may end up being the case. But as the questioner correctly notes, support for maintaining the legality of those medicinal options is particularly strong among young people. And I think it's worth going back to something we talked about in answer to the first question, Claire. Anyone in the United States of America who's 49 years old or younger has never lived in a country in which Roe versus Wade was not the law of the land. So as I said earlier, often for someone who's younger, the argument sounds somewhat abstract because it's just simply not imaginable that Roe v. Wade would be overturned. But for those younger people, the prospect of not just having the abortion procedure through surgery made illegal, but a medicinal option being prohibited as well, that could end up being a very significant vote motivator. And already we're seeing evidence from Joe Biden and Kamala Harris on down that Democrats are intending to use that issue, not only to motivate progressive voters, but in particular, young progressive voters, particularly young women, both on the broader question of Roe v. Wade and these medicinal options as well.
Well, Dan, thank you so much for doing this additional follow-up on such an important and pressing issue. We're lucky that we get a little bit more than just our monthly session with you. So we appreciate this, and I'm looking forward to next month's program already.
I'm already looking forward to it too, Claire. Thank you very much, and thanks as always to all of our viewers, our audience members who make these programs so interesting. Good day, everybody.